Sponsors that are funding collaborative research are taking a risk in funding you. They'll want to see from your proposals that you have identified and considered the major risks and have plans in place to reduce or exclude these risks. This short presentation looks at ways of identifying and managing risks to your project. Firstly, what are the possible risks to your collaboration? There are some obvious ones that might relate to funding, recruitment, ethics, health and safety, or data management, but it can be difficult to identify very many, and you might need to do some research. You should start by thinking as broadly as you can and looking at risks associated with different aspects of your project. Not just the obvious ones, but also those associated with people and disciplines involved. You should allocate some time on the agenda of each of your project meetings to discuss risk. At the start of your project, could you ask each partner to think about these different topics and report back on their ideas on the possible risks at your first meeting? You could use these examples as a starter to identify the risks that are most relevant to your particular collaboration project. You will need to show your sponsors that you have a robust risk management plan. For each of the individual risks that you identify, the next stage is to determine how likely they are to happen, and if they were to happen, what would be the impact on the success of your project. You should focus your attention on those risks that have a high score in both of these categories. And then think about what you can do to either reduce the impact if they were to happen, or the likelihood of them happening in the first place. This is an example of a very commonly used grid which allows you to prioritise the risks that the project is under. Think about each risk in turn and allocate them a score as to whether their impact would be insignificant or major or even extreme if it was to happen. And also think about the probability or likelihood. Is it going to be rare or almost certain? By allocating a score to likelihood and impact, you can then identify those with a very high risk, and then you can go on to create a priority list and then a risk register for the project. So your overall goal is to try to move your risks to the bottom left quadrant on this map. What could you do to either reduce the impact of the risks happening or the likelihood of them happening in the first place? For your high risks, allocate some time to discuss with your partners ways to, firstly, monitor for signs of the risk emerging. Perhaps there are some data that you could be collecting or some warning signs that you could be looking out for to see if the risk is likely to happen. Or what could you do to minimise the likelihood of the risk occurring in the first place? If you can't minimise the likelihood, then could you minimise the impact on the project if the risk could not be eliminated? Are there any contingencies or different options in the event of the risk being realised? And finally, if the risk is very high and it would have a severe effect on the success of the project, should you consider avoiding it altogether by changing the focus of the project or the methods that you're using? In classic project management, you would then create and maintain a risk register such as this. The register includes details of each of the risks that you've identified, whether the risk assessment is high or low, who is responsible for managing that risk and monitoring it, and what are your strategies for minimising the risk or for dealing with them if they happen. The register should be reviewed periodically to monitor for a change in likelihood or impact, and the review process should be a regular agenda item for project meetings. A template risk register is available to download from the DW4 Collaboration Lifecycle webpage, or you could easily create your own. This will help with planning and monitoring not only for your own requirements, but also for those of your sponsor.